Now, Julian Assange's legal team claim that there are serious threats to his life from inside the CIA. They even say that they've seen and got evidence of a CIA plot to assassinate Assange. I mean, it sounds very far-fetched. I spoke with Julian Assange's high-profile lawyer, Jennifer Robinson. She's an Australian who's based in the UK, about his case and these stunning claims. I started by asking her about Julian Assange's reaction to the court decision to delay his appeal after his wife, Stella, said she was astounded by it.
I spent yesterday afternoon in prison with him after the judgment came down, going over the decision. And of course, it's disappointing. We are in a position where the court has, in fact, validated the concerns we've long had about this case, about the risk to free speech if he's extradited, about the risk he'd be exposed to the death penalty, about the discrimination he'll face as an Australian citizen in receiving constitutional protections. And yet the court yesterday decided, even though these are problems, we're going to offer the US the opportunity to remedy these fundamentally fatal flaws in their case by mere political promises. And this is unacceptable. This is an award-winning Australian citizen and journalist who is facing life in prison in the United States, and to extradite him on this basis, or potentially extradite him on this basis in the coming months, is unacceptable in our view.
If Assange is extradited to the US, are you concerned about the treatment he'd face under the justice system, and even whether he could potentially face the death penalty?
The facts as set out on the Department of Justice indictment, as the US counsel in our extradition case acknowledged, could expose him to the death penalty, and the US has offered no assurance against that. So it is a risk, and it shouldn't be a risk. This is it's something that could be easily remediable by the US, and it's been 5 years of this extradition request being pursued by the US government, and no assurance has been forthcoming. We have been pointing this out for years, and yet here we are 5 years down the line. Julian Assange has been in a high security prison for 5 years without any charges, let alone without any conviction. And here we are 5 years later. And our position is we shouldn't even be talking about assurances, because as Amnesty International says, US assurances aren't worth the paper they're written on in any event. But what we should be talking about is the Department of Justice closing this case down. It is a case that threatens free speech everywhere. It threatens journalists and editors everywhere. If you publish truthful information about the United States, if you reveal human rights abuse and war crimes committed by the United States, then you could face life in prison without any constitutional free speech protections. That's a dangerous precedent.
But does Julian Assange accept, though, that his leaks may have endangered anyone or even could have cost lives?
There's no evidence, even on the US's own case, that anyone was physically harmed as a result of the WikiLeaks disclosures. There are a lot of statements by the government saying, well, this potentially caused harm, we needed to move people from particular embassies. But this ignores the immense public interest in these publications, revelations about war crimes, the killing of thousands more civilians in the Iraq War than was ever acknowledged. War crimes, corruption the world over. This material has been used in court cases around the world. Julian has won the highest journalistic award in Australia. He's won the Sydney Peace Prize. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year since. And when we're talking about journalism and publication and public interest, these things have to be weighed up. No one was physically harmed, and look what was revealed.
Isn't there a difference, though, that a journalist would have carefully gone through the information and selected what was in the public interest, but what wasn't going to potentially jeopardise lives, jeopardise sources, or require sources to be moved out of foreign countries? Isn't that what separates a journalist from just the dumping of information online like Julian Assange did?
I'm glad you asked that question, Sharri, because there's a huge misunderstanding about what actually happened with the WikiLeaks publications. There was not a dumping of the material online. WikiLeaks engaged in careful redaction processes with over 100 media partners around the world before the material was released online by another website in the United States because of a security breach, not by WikiLeaks, but by the Guardian newspaper. So the fact that this sort of argument that Julian just dumped material out into the public domain is simply incorrect. And I really urge you and your viewers to have a look at the evidence before the court and look into this issue, because WikiLeaks engaged in a very careful redaction process, and to the extent that the material was dumped out online, that was done by another website in the United States, not by WikiLeaks.
Is it accurate that a witness that you had wanted to give evidence in your court case has claimed that the CIA has plans to kidnap or even potentially assassinate Assange? Can you tell me about this?
This is an outrageous story, but one that is supported by more than a Yahoo News investigation, supported by more than 30 government sources, that the Trump administration had in fact planned to kidnap and kill Julian Assange in London. We have been trying to adduce this evidence in the extradition proceedings, showing that this shows the broader persecution of Julian Assange, that he's been targeted because of his political opinions, and about our concerns about what will happen to him once extradited to the United States. When you have a government that is planning to plot and kill a journalist, an Australian journalist, how can we have any faith in the way they're going to be treated within the legal system, particularly in a context where those same intelligence agencies who wanted to kill him have the power to put him under the kinds of oppressive prison conditions the medical evidence shows would cause his death? I know that sounds absurd, but this is precisely what's happening in Julian's case. He couldn't make it up.
Jennifer, what would be the motivation to kill Assange now? The information's already out there.
Sharri, I think you're missing the point. Whether or not what the intention is, we know from this story what is their intention now. I can't imagine why the CIA would kill a journalist in any event, or plan to kill a journalist in any event. The fact is that the CIA
did. You think this is credible? You think this is credible information?
It is credible information. We have whistleblowers from inside the Ecuadorian embassy who spoke about how they talked about poisoning Julian, the security company inside the embassy. That evidence is before the court. We've got a huge journalistic investigation supported by more than 30 internal sources from the CIA saying that from the government saying that this was a plan to plot and kill an Australian journalist. And Mike Pompeo, when the information was released, said that those who released it should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for having released the information. So I don't know how much more confirmation than you need. But as a fellow journalist, are you not concerned that there is sufficient information in the public domain to even reasonably conclude that the CIA had a plan to kill a journalist, and a fellow Australian journalist?
I think it's an extraordinary allegation, which is exactly why I raised it during this interview now. Just finally, Jennifer, the Albanese government has been raising Julian Assange's case with the US administration. Do you feel like the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is doing enough?
Well, first, Sharri, I want to say I'm grateful to the Australian Prime Minister, the government and our Parliament and the Australian people for the huge amount of support that Julian's received in the recent times, and we know that the Prime Minister has raised this directly with President Biden. We want him to continue to do that. But what we want to say to the Australian government now is this is the time. The case is at the sharp end. We really are in a position where Julian could be extradited to the United States in a matter of months. If the US comes up with the assurances the court has requested, we've seen in this case that the court will wave through even unacceptable, in our view, assurances in order to be able to extradite him to the United States. So we face the very real prospect that he could be in the US in the coming months. That is unacceptable. That is a risk to his life. It's unacceptable for an Australian citizen to be in this position. And as the Australian Prime Minister has said, enough is enough. But what is the Australian government doing, and what pressure are they bringing to bear on the US to secure the outcome of Julian coming home to Australia? And that's a question for the Australian government. But we are insisting and asking the Australian government to do everything they can, because this is really we're coming to the end of the case.
Yeah. All right, Jennifer Robinson, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.